Some women face their mortality by writing letters to loved ones or making peace with the past. Lenora Beck decided to buy herself a baby from the biggest cowboy in New Mexico territory. Fresh off the Santa Fe stage in 1870's Red Bluff, this wealthy widow had one last chance at leaving something meaningful behind. Cole Maddox stood 6'6", worked cattle with his shirt off, and carried himself like a man who'd lost everything that mattered. Their deal was simple. Her gold for his child, no feelings involved. But Lenora was past the age when women bear children, and Cole had buried too many dreams to believe in new ones. What happens when two broken people make an impossible bargain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Red Bluff. It hung in the air like unfinished business, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that spoke to the impermanence of frontier life. Buildings stood weathered and sun-bleached, their wooden facades bearing the scars of harsh winters and merciless summers. The town existed because the railroad needed water, and the railroad paid well enough to keep a collection of saloons, a general store, a doctor's office, and a handful of other enterprises limping along in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Lenora Beck stepped down from the Santa Fe stage with the careful grace of a woman accustomed to being watched. At 42, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that money could preserve but not create. High cheekbones that caught the light just so, silver-streaked auburn hair pinned beneath a traveling hat that cost more than most men in Red Bluff, earned in a month, and hands encased in pristine white silk gloves that had never known honest work. Her dark blue traveling dress, though practical by Boston standards, marked her as surely as if she'd worn a sign declaring her wealth. The other passengers, a drummer selling patent medicines, a young couple heading west with hollow eyes and empty pockets, gave her a wide berth as they collected their meager belongings. Lenora's trunks required 3 men to manage, and she paid the stage driver's exorbitant handling fee without blinking. Money, she had learned in her 42 years, was either a tool or a burden. She intended it to be the former. "Ma'am, you'll be wanting the boarding house," the stage driver offered, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment." "Thank you, no." Lenora's voice carried the crisp consonants of proper Boston education, softened slightly by genuine courtesy. "I'll be taking rooms at the Cattleman's Rest." The driver's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. The Cattleman's Rest was a saloon first, lodging house second, and no place for a lady of obvious breeding. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "I appreciate your concern." She pressed a silver dollar into his weathered palm. "But I have business that requires me to be where the working men gather." Lenora had done her research during the long journey west. 3 letters from her late husband's business associates, conversations with travelers at way stations, and careful inquiries had painted a picture of Red Bluff's social geography. The boarding house catered to families and traveling salesmen. The Cattleman's Rest served the men who built railroads and drove cattle, men who worked with their hands and backs, men who might possess the physical strength she required. The saloon occupied a corner lot, its swinging doors propped open to catch whatever breeze might stir in the afternoon heat. Piano music drifted out, not the refined compositions Lenora knew, but something with more rhythm than melody. She gathered her skirts and stepped across the threshold into a world that smelled of tobacco, whiskey, and unwashed humanity. Conversations died as she entered. A dozen men in various states of cleanliness turned to stare at this vision of Eastern refinement invading their sanctuary. The piano player's fingers stuttered to a stop. Even the bartender, a thick-bodied Irishman with arms like tree trunks, paused in the act of wiping down a glass. "Gentlemen," Lenora said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "I wonder if I might have a word with your proprietor." "That'd be me, Mum." The bartender set down his glass and approached with the careful respect reserved for unstable explosives. "Murphy's the name, Sean Murphy. How might I be of service? I understand you have rooms available for rent. Well, yes, ma'am, but they ain't. That is to say, they're more suited to—" Murphy's Irish brogue thickened with his discomfort. "I'm quite certain they'll suffice." Lenora opened her small purse and placed a $20 gold piece on the scarred wooden bar. The coin caught the light streaming through the dusty windows and seemed to glow with its own fire. "I'll take your finest accommodation for an indefinite period. And Mr. Murphy, I'll need you to pass along a message that Mrs. Lenora Beck has arrived and wishes to conduct some business with the local cattleman." The gold piece had the desired effect. Murphy's objections evaporated like spit on a hot griddle. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. Boy," he hollered toward the back of the establishment. "Tommy, get up here and help the lady with her luggage." As Lenora was shown to her Spartan but clean room on the second floor, she could hear the excited buzz of conversation resuming below. Word would spread quickly in a town this size. By evening, every man worth considering would know of her arrival and her purpose, or at least the purpose she chose to reveal. The room held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair positioned near the window that looked out onto Main Street. Lenora removed her gloves carefully, folding them with the same precision she brought to every task. These gloves had been a wedding gift from her late husband 17 years ago, crafted by the finest leather workers in Boston. They represented everything she was leaving behind: privilege, propriety, and the suffocating expectations of a society that measured a woman's worth by her ability to produce heirs. Charles Beck had been a good man, if not a passionate one. Their marriage had been a practical arrangement that benefited both families' railroad interests. He had been kind, considerate, and utterly incapable of stirring any deeper feeling in her heart. For 17 years, she had played the role of dutiful wife, managing his household, attending the right social functions, and trying desperately to conceive the child that would secure both their legacies. The doctors had been discreet but thorough in their examinations. Unexplained infertility, they had called it, as if giving it a name might somehow solve the problem. Month after month, year after year, Lenora had endured the disappointment, the whispered speculation, the barely concealed pity of other wives, who seemed to conceive as easily as breathing. Charles had never reproached her for their childless state, which somehow made it worse. His acceptance felt like resignation, as if he too had given up hope. When he died suddenly of a heart attack 6 months ago, leaving her his considerable fortune and the bitter knowledge that the Beck name would die with her, Lenora had made a decision that would have horrified her younger self. She would not let biology defeat her. If nature and her own body would not cooperate, she would find another way to ensure that something of value outlived her. Her money would buy what marriage had failed to provide, but she would choose the father with the same care she might select a prize stallion. She wanted strength, health, character, and the kind of rugged vitality that Eastern gentlemen seemed to lack. The research had led her west, to cattle country where men lived hard and died young, where physical prowess mattered more than social connections. Red Bluff had appeared promising, isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention from proper society, but prosperous enough to attract capable men. The railroad brought regular communication with the outside world, and the territorial government was still flexible enough that unusual arrangements might be accommodated without excessive legal complications. A knock at her door interrupted her planning. "Come in!" Tommy, a gangling youth of perhaps 16, peered around the doorframe. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mr. Murphy says there's some gentleman downstairs asking to meet with you. Cattle boss named Jameson and his foreman. Please, tell them I'll be down shortly." Lenora checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, tucking a stray strand of hair back into place. First impressions mattered, especially in business. The saloon had filled considerably during her brief absence. Word of her arrival and her gold had clearly spread through the community like wildfire. Men who had probably never seen a woman of her obvious breeding now tried not to stare while she descended the stairs. Some had even made an effort to slick back their hair and brush dust from their clothes. Two men waited near the bar, distinguishable from the others by their air of authority and the deference shown them by their surroundings. The older man, somewhere north of 50 with greying hair and a neat moustache, stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Ma'am, I'm Bill Jameson. I run the Circle J spread about 10 miles north of town. This here's my foreman, Jake Williams." He gestured to a younger man with calculating eyes and a carefully groomed appearance that suggested ambition. "We understand. You're looking to do some business with cattlefolk." "Indeed I am, Mr. Jameson." Lenora accepted his offered handshake with the firm grip her father had taught her years ago. "I'm interested in engaging the services of someone with very specific qualifications. Well, now, we'd be happy to discuss whatever you might need. Stock handling, trail driving, ranch management. The Circle J employs some of the finest hands in the territory." Lenora glanced around the crowded saloon, noting the dozen or more ears straining to catch every word. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation in a more private setting. I have a proposition that requires discretion." Jameson's eyes sharpened with interest. In his experience, propositions requiring discretion usually involved significant money or significant risk, often both. "Murphy's got a back room he uses for poker games. Would that suit?" "Perfectly." The back room smelled of cigar smoke and contained a round table surrounded by mismatched chairs. A single oil lamp provided flickering illumination. Jameson gestured for Lenora to take the seat facing the door, a courtesy that didn't go unnoticed. "Now then, Mrs. Beck, what exactly are you looking to accomplish?" Lenora folded her hands on the table and met his gaze directly. "I'm looking for a man to father my child." The silence that followed was profound. Jake Williams made a sound that might have been a cough or a strangled laugh. Jameson's face went through several expressions before settling on professional wariness. "Ma'am, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Mr. Jameson. I'm a wealthy widow with no heirs. I wish to remedy that situation through a straightforward business arrangement. I'm prepared to pay handsomely for the right man's cooperation." Jameson leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity he might examine a horse he was considering buying. And what exactly would constitute the right man? Physical strength and health are paramount. Good character, proven ability to work hard and honor agreements. A man who understands that this would be strictly a business transaction, with no romantic complications or ongoing obligations beyond the conception of a child. And the compensation? $1,000 upon confirmation of pregnancy, with additional considerations for discretion and cooperation throughout the process. Both men sat in stunned silence. $1,000 represented more than most Cowboys earned in 5 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch, or at least a very fine horse, and enough cattle to start a herd. "Mrs. Beck," Jameson said carefully, "what you're describing is, well, it ain't exactly common practice. I'm aware that my proposal is unconventional. However, I believe there are men who might find the arrangement mutually beneficial. I'm not seeking emotional attachment or marriage, simply a biological transaction between consenting adults." Williams found his voice. "And you'd want this man to just disappear afterward?" "Not disappear, but our association would end once the child is conceived. He would have no parental rights or responsibilities, and I would make no claims on his time or affections beyond the terms of our agreement." Jameson stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "This is a hell of a thing to consider, ma'am. Most decent men don't think of fatherhood as a business proposition. Most decent men have wives and children of their own. I'm looking for someone whose circumstances might make my offer attractive, someone who needs the money more than he needs conventional respectability." The brutal honesty of her assessment hung in the air. Both men understood that she was describing Most of the cowboys in the territory, men who worked dangerous, poorly paid jobs with little hope of accumulating enough capital to establish themselves as anything more than hired hands. "I'll need some time to think on this," Jameson said finally, "and to talk to some folks. This ain't the kind of thing a man decides in a hurry. Of course, I'll be staying here at the Cattleman's Rest indefinitely. When you're ready to discuss specific candidates, please let me know." As they filed out of the back room, Lenora caught a glimpse of the main saloon through the doorway. Near the bar, towering above every other man in the establishment, stood a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his work shirt and arms corded, with muscle that spoke of years spent wrestling cattle and hay bales. His dark hair hung slightly long, curling at the collar, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent his life outdoors. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue and filled with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Cole Maddox stood at the bar nursing a whiskey, unaware that his life was about to change forever. In his weathered hands, he held his father's old branding iron. Not the tool itself, but a small wooden replica he had carved during the long, lonely evenings since losing everything that had once given his life meaning. The Circle M brand was burned into the wood with loving detail, a memento of dreams that had died with his wife and child 3 years ago. This was the man Lenora Beck had traveled 1,500 miles to find, though neither of them knew it yet. Cole Maddox had not slept well in 3 years, and last night had been no exception. He sat on the edge of his narrow bunk in the ranch hand's quarters, rolling the wooden replica of his father's brand between calloused palms as the first light of dawn crept through the single window. The other hands were still snoring, their bodies exhausted from another day of backbreaking labor under the relentless New Mexico sun. The carved piece of wood had become his ritual, his anchor to a past that felt both precious and poisonous. Every morning he held it and remembered what it meant to have something worth protecting. The Circle M Ranch had been in his family for 2 generations before drought, disease, and bad luck had stolen it away. Sarah and little Thomas were buried on land that now belonged to strangers, their graves marked by weathered wooden crosses that probably wouldn't survive another harsh winter. A man shouldn't outlive his child. That thought had haunted every sunrise for 3 years. Doc Harrison found him there an hour later, hat in hand, and wearing the careful expression of someone bearing complicated news. "Cole, you got a minute? There's something we need to discuss." Harrison was the closest thing Red Bluff had to a lawyer, in addition to being its only physician. He handled contracts, witnessed agreements, and generally served as the voice of legal authority in a territory where such things were often handled with guns rather than paperwork. His presence this early in the morning couldn't mean anything good. "What is it, Doc?" "There's a woman in town, wealthy widow from back east. She's made a proposition that, well, it's unusual. Bill Jameson seems to think you might be interested." Cole slipped the wooden brand into his shirt pocket and stood, his full height making the small room feel even more cramped. "What kind of proposition?" Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The kind that requires a private conversation. She's staying at Murphy's place, says she'll meet with any man willing to hear her out." The walk to the Cattleman's Rest took 15 minutes through the dusty streets of Red Bluff. Cole nodded to the few early risers he encountered, the baker lighting his ovens, old Pete sweeping the front of the general store, Mrs. Patterson hanging laundry behind the boarding house. These people knew his story, and their expressions carried the careful sympathy reserved for a man who had lost everything but his ability to work. The saloon was quiet at this hour, chairs still stacked on tables from the previous night's cleaning. Murphy himself was nowhere to be seen, but the sound of quiet conversation drifted from the back room. Harrison knocked gently on the doorframe. "Ma'am, this is Cole Maddox, the man I mentioned. Please come in." The voice was cultured, precise, nothing like the frontier women Cole was accustomed to hearing. When he stepped into the room, he found himself face to face with the most elegantly dressed woman he had ever seen outside of a painting. Her dark blue dress was perfectly fitted, her hair arranged with mathematical precision, and her hands folded on the table with the poise of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard. They held intelligence, determination, and something that looked very much like desperation carefully controlled. "Mr. Maddox, please sit down. Dr. Harrison, would you mind staying to witness our conversation?" Cole lowered himself into the chair. Across from her, his size making the furniture seem designed for children. "Ma'am, I am Mrs. Lenora Beck. I understand you've experienced some financial difficulties in recent years." The directness of her statement hit like a physical blow. Cole's jaw tightened. "I've had my share of troubles. I'm not here to offer pity, Mr. Maddox. I'm here to offer a business proposition that might benefit us both." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded document. "I need a man to father my child. You need money. I believe we can reach a mutually beneficial arrangement." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Cole stared at her, trying to process what he had just heard. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion." "No confusion, Mr. Maddox. I am 42 years old, recently widowed and childless. I have considerable financial resources, but limited time to achieve my goal of motherhood through conventional means. I'm prepared to offer you $1,000 to help me conceive a child." Cole's hand instinctively moved to the wooden brand in his pocket. $1,000. It was more money than he had ever imagined possessing. It was enough to buy back his family's land, or at least a piece of ground where he could start over. It was enough to stop being another man's hired hand and become his own boss again. It was also the most outrageous proposition he had ever heard. "You want to buy a baby. I want to hire someone to help me create one. The child would be mine entirely. You would have no parental obligations or rights. Our association would end once conception occurs. And you think I'm the kind of man who would sell himself like a prize bull?" Lenora's composure never wavered. "I think you're the kind of man who understands that sometimes survival requires unconventional choices. I've made inquiries about your character and circumstances. You've lost your ranch, your family, everything you worked to build. This arrangement could give you the resources to start over." The accuracy of her assessment stung worse than the insult. Cole stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Lady, I don't know what kind of man you think I am, but I think you're a man who's been beaten down by circumstances beyond your control. I think you're proud, hard-working, and desperate enough to consider an arrangement that goes against every conventional notion of propriety." She stood as well, meeting his gaze with unflinching directness. "I think you're exactly the kind of man I need." Cole turned toward the door, then stopped. The wooden brand seemed to burn in his pocket, a reminder of dreams that had died with his family. $1,000 would buy those dreams back. Not the exact same dreams, but the possibility of dreams. How would this work? Harrison cleared his throat. "If you gentlemen, that is, if both parties were to agree to such an arrangement, we'd need to draw up a contract, specific terms, compensation schedule, confidentiality agreements." "I've already prepared a draft," Lenora said, unfolding the document she had withdrawn earlier. "The terms are straightforward. You would be compensated $500 upon signing, with the remainder paid when pregnancy is confirmed. Discretion would be required from both parties. The arrangement would take place at a location of mutual agreement over whatever period proves necessary." Cole stared at the papers covered in precise legal language. The words seemed to swim before his eyes as he tried to comprehend what she was proposing. "You've got this all figured out. I've had considerable time to think through the practicalities. Mr. Maddox, I understand this is not a conventional request, but I believe it offers advantages to both of us that conventional arrangements do not." "What kind of advantages?" For you, financial independence and the opportunity to rebuild your life. For me, the chance to bear a child with a man of proven strength and character, without the complications of romance or marriage. The word romance seemed to stick in Cole's throat. He had loved once, completely and devastatingly. The idea of trying to manufacture those feelings again, or worse, of pretending to feel them for money, made his stomach turn. But a business arrangement, cold, clean, with clearly defined boundaries, that was something he might be able to manage. I need time to think, of course. But Mr. Maddox, I should mention that I won't be in Red Bluff indefinitely. I'm prepared to make this arrangement with the right man, but if I can't find him here, I'll look elsewhere. The gentle threat was delivered with the same cultured politeness she had maintained throughout their conversation. Cole understood that she was serious, that she would leave if necessary and find someone else willing to accept her proposition. The thought bothered him more than it should have. He spent the day working cattle, letting physical exhaustion drown out the chaos in his mind. The other hands noticed his distraction, but none of them dared comment. Cole Maddox was not a man you questioned lightly, especially when he wore that particular expression of barely controlled intensity. That evening, he sat alone in the bunkhouse while the other men played cards and told stories. The wooden brand lay on the rough blanket covering his narrow mattress, its familiar weight somehow both comforting and accusatory. His father had built the Circle M from nothing, working 16-hour days and saving every penny to create something lasting. Cole had inherited that dream, expanded it, married Sarah, and begun planning for the day when he would pass it on to his own son. Thomas had lived only 3 days, long enough to open his eyes once and grip his father's finger with tiny, perfect hands, long enough to break Cole's heart so completely that he still felt the shards of it grinding against his ribs every time he drew breath. $1,000 wouldn't bring back his son, but it might give him the chance to build something worthy of Thomas's memory. At dawn, Cole walked back to the Cattleman's Rest. He found Lenora in the dining area, taking breakfast alone, while the few other patrons gave her a respectful distance. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression suggested she had been expecting him. "Mrs. Beck, I'd like to discuss your proposition." She set down her coffee cup with steady hands. "Dr. Harrison is in his office. Shall we ask him to witness our conversation?" 20 minutes later, Cole Maddox signed his name to a contract unlike any that had ever been drawn up in the New Mexico territory. The ink was still wet when Lenora Beck counted out $500 in gold coins and pushed them across the table toward him. The weight of the coins in his hands felt like possibility and damnation combined. The Morrison Ranch had been abandoned for 2 years before Lenora Beck arrived, with a deed of purchase and a wagon full of supplies. Located 5 miles east of Red Bluff, the property consisted of a weathered but solid ranch house, a barn that needed considerable repair and enough grazing land to support a small herd. The previous owners had been driven out by a combination of drought and debt, leaving behind only the bones of their dreams and a few pieces of furniture too heavy to move. Lenora had bought it sight unseen for $800, a sum that would have seemed impossible to the property's original owners, but represented little more than a minor expense to her. She needed privacy for the arrangement she had made with Cole Maddox, and a hotel room in town would provide neither the discretion nor the space required for their unconventional situation. Cole arrived on a Thursday morning, his few possessions tied behind his saddle, and a look of grim determination etched into his weathered features. He found Lenora on the front porch, consulting a leather-bound journal while wearing a practical brown dress that marked her first concession to frontier life. Her pristine white gloves lay folded beside her, temporarily abandoned in favor of more sensible work. "Mrs. Beck." He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Mr. Maddox, I trust you found the place without difficulty." "Yes, ma'am. The directions were clear enough." He dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, noting the improvements she had already made. New glass in the windows, repairs to the roof, and a coat of whitewash that made the house look almost welcoming. "I've prepared the back bedroom for your use. It's small but private, and it has its own entrance through the kitchen. I thought that arrangement would be most appropriate given the nature of our association." The careful distance in her voice matched his own discomfort. Neither of them had addressed the practical realities of their agreement since signing the contract 3 days earlier. The clinical language of the legal document had made it seem straightforward, but facing each other now, in the isolation of the ranch, both realized how little they had actually discussed. Cole carried his gear to the indicated room, a narrow space that had probably served as a pantry or storage area in the house's better days. Lenora had furnished it with a single bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair positioned beneath the small window that looked out toward the mountains. It was austere but clean, and after 3 years of sleeping in bunkhouses, the privacy felt like luxury. "I've taken the liberty of consulting with Dr. Harrison about the most favorable timing for our arrangement," Lenora said when he rejoined her in the main room. She held her journal open to a page covered with dates and notations in precise handwriting. "According to my calculations, we should begin our attempts in approximately 10 days. The word attempts made Cole's jaw clench. The clinical terminology reduced their future intimacy to something resembling a medical procedure, which he supposed was exactly what Lenora intended. He had agreed to this arrangement for the money, but facing the reality of it made his skin crawl with a combination of anticipation and revulsion. "In the meantime," she continued, apparently oblivious to his discomfort, "I thought we might work together to make this place more habitable. The barn needs significant repairs, and there are several other projects that would benefit from your expertise." Cole nodded, grateful for something practical to focus on. "I'll take a look around, see what needs doing." The next 10 days established a pattern that felt both natural and artificial. They rose early, shared a simple breakfast in companionable silence, then spent their days working to restore the ranch. Cole proved to be a skilled carpenter and general handyman, able to repair sagging beams, replace rotted floorboards, and restore the barn to functional condition. Lenora threw herself into the domestic aspects of their temporary home, cooking meals, managing supplies, and maintaining detailed records of their expenses and progress. They worked well together. Cole discovered Lenora was intelligent and adaptable, quick to learn tasks that had obviously been foreign to her sheltered upbringing. She didn't complain about broken fingernails or blisters, and she listened carefully to his instructions without the wounded pride he had expected from a woman of her social standing. But underneath their surface cooperation, both remained acutely aware of the approaching date marked in Lenora's journal. The tension grew with each passing day, manifesting in awkward silences, careful physical distance, and conversations that stopped abruptly when they veered too close to personal territory. On the 9th day, while Cole was replacing the handle on the kitchen pump, Lenora approached him with her journal clutched against her chest like armor. "Mr. Maddox, I believe we should discuss the practical arrangements for tomorrow evening." Cole's hands stilled on the pump handle. "What kind of arrangements?" "Dr. Harrison has provided some medical guidance regarding the most effective methods. For conception, there are certain positions and techniques that are more likely to result in pregnancy." The clinical discussion of their future intimacy made Cole's stomach turn. He set down his tools and faced her directly. "Mrs. Beck, I understand. This is a business arrangement. But when the time comes, I'd prefer to handle things in a more natural way." Color rose in Lenora's cheeks, the first real emotion he had seen her display since their initial meeting. "Of course. I simply thought that since we both want this arrangement to succeed as quickly as possible, we should consider every advantage. It'll succeed or it won't, but I'm not going to treat you like a piece of livestock, contract or no contract." His words seemed to surprise her. She studied his face for a long moment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "I appreciate your consideration, Mr. Maddox. I fear I've become so focused on the practical aspects that I've forgotten the human elements involved. We're both human, Mrs. Beck. That's something we can't contract away." That evening they shared their most natural conversation since his arrival. Lenora told him about her life in Boston, her loveless marriage, and the social pressures that had driven her to such desperate measures. Cole found himself talking about Sarah, about the son he had lost, about the dreams that had died with his family. Neither of them mentioned the approaching night, but its presence hung between them like a storm waiting to break. Lenora's medical journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with dates and clinical observations that reduced their arrangement to a series of calculations. The leather binding was worn from constant handling, its pages bearing witness to her desperate need for control over a situation that was fundamentally beyond anyone's control. On the 10th morning, Cole woke to find Lenora already dressed and standing at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and red. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, and her usually perfect hair hung loose around her shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Maddox." "Ma'am." He moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with his hands. "Coffee's still hot. I made it early." "I couldn't sleep." They stood in silence, drinking coffee and watching the day begin. Both understood that when evening came, their careful distance would end, and their arrangement would move from theory to reality. The thought terrified and excited them both, though neither would admit it aloud. "Mr. Maddox," Lenora said finally, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens tonight, I respect the difficulty of what I've asked you to do." Cole studied her profile in the morning light. Without her careful armor of proper dress and rigid posture, she looked younger, more vulnerable. For the first time, he wondered what had driven a woman of obvious refinement to such desperate measures. "It takes two people to make this work, Mrs. Beck. I reckon we're both doing what we have to do." The leather journal remained open on the table between them, its clinical pages a reminder that their approaching intimacy was built on necessity rather than affection. But as the sun climbed higher and the day stretched ahead, both began to suspect that the neat categories of their contract might not contain the complicated emotions already growing between them. 3 months had passed since that first awkward night, and the Morrison Ranch bore little resemblance to the abandoned property Lenora had purchased. The barn stood solid and weatherproof, the house gleamed with fresh paint and new glass, and the corrals could once again hold livestock. Cole had thrown himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if physical exhaustion might quiet the growing confusion in his mind. Their arrangement had settled into a routine, as carefully structured as everything else in Lenora's life. 3 times each month, according to the calculations in her medical journal, they came together with the clinical precision of a medical procedure. No words were exchanged during these encounters, no tenderness offered or expected. Cole performed his part of their contract with the grim efficiency of any other ranch chore, while Lenora endured it with the stoic determination that had carried her through 17 years of loveless marriage. But the expected result had not occurred, and with each passing month, the strain grew more evident in both their faces. Lenora sat at the kitchen table on a grey October morning, her medical journal open before her like an accusatory witness. The pages chronicled 3 months of failed attempts, each carefully documented failure adding to her growing sense of despair. At 42, she was already considered past the ideal age for childbearing. Each month that passed without success reduced her chances further. Cole entered the kitchen, carrying an armload of firewood, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. He'd been splitting logs since before dawn, another sleepless night driving him to seek solace in physical labor. The sight of Lenora, hunched over her journal, defeat written in every line of her body, made something twist painfully in his chest. "Morning, Mrs. Beck." She looked up, and he was startled to see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. In 3 months of cohabitation, he had never seen her display such vulnerability. "Good morning, Mr. Maddox. I fear I have some disappointing news to report." Cole set down the firewood and moved to the stove, busying himself with coffee to avoid meeting her gaze. "Your monthly courses came again." "Yes, right on schedule, as documented in my calculations." Her voice carried a bitter edge that was new to their careful conversations. "Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that this arrangement may not achieve its intended purpose." The words hit Cole harder than he had expected. 3 months ago, he would have welcomed news that their contract might be dissolved. Now the thought of Lenora leaving filled him with something approaching panic. 3 months ain't very long, Mrs. Beck. Some couples try for years before. He stopped, realizing what he had said. They weren't a couple. They were business partners, with a very specific and limited arrangement. "Some couples," Lenora repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose some couples do have that luxury of time and hope. But we're not a couple, are we, Mr. Maddox? We're 2 people engaged in a transaction that seems destined to fail." Cole poured 2 cups of coffee, buying time while he wrestled with feelings he didn't want to examine too closely. When he set her cup on the table, his fingers accidentally brushed hers, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through his system. "Maybe the problem is that we're treating it like a transaction." Lenora's eyes snapped up to meet his. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe all this calculating and scheduling and clinical approach is working against what we're trying to accomplish. Maybe we need to be more natural about it." Color flooded Lenora's cheeks. In 3 months of intimate contact, they had never discussed the actual mechanics of their arrangement. The clinical encounters occurred in darkness and silence, with minimal contact beyond what was strictly necessary for their purpose. "I'm not certain I understand what you're suggesting." Cole sat down across from her, noting how she immediately stiffened at his proximity. This was part of the problem. They lived in the same house, shared meals and conversations, worked side by side during the day, but maintained careful emotional and physical distance. Their intimacy was scheduled and artificial, devoid of any real connection. "I'm suggesting that maybe we need to get to know each other better. Talk more, spend time together that isn't about work or our arrangement. Maybe if we were more comfortable with each other, things might work better." "Mr. Maddox, our contract specifically states that this is to remain a business arrangement without romantic complications." "I'm not talking about romance. I'm talking about basic human connection. Right now, we're like strangers who happen to share the same roof. That ain't natural for what we're trying to do." Lenora closed her medical journal with a sharp snap. "Very well, what do you propose?" The question caught Cole off guard. He hadn't expected her to agree so readily, and he wasn't entirely sure what he was proposing. "Maybe we could start by talking more during meals in the evenings, learn something about each other beyond the business arrangement." That evening, after their usual silent supper, Cole surprised Lenora by remaining at the table instead of retreating to his room or the barn. She sat holding her coffee cup, clearly uncertain how to proceed with this new dynamic. "Tell me about Boston," Cole said finally. "What was your life like there?" The simple question seemed to unlock something. In Lenora, she began talking about her childhood in a mansion on Beacon Hill, her father's railroad empire, the suffocating expectations of Boston society. Her voice grew more animated as she described the elaborate balls and dinner parties that had filled her social calendar, the careful political maneuvering required to maintain her family's position. "It sounds lonely," Cole observed when she paused. "Lonely?" Lenora seemed genuinely surprised by his assessment. "But I was surrounded by people constantly. There were always social obligations, visitors, engagements. Surrounded by people who wanted something from your family's money and connections. That ain't the same as having folks who care about you as a person." The truth of his words settled over her like a revelation. "I suppose you're right. I can't think of a single person in Boston who would have mourned my absence for personal reasons rather than social convenience." "What about your husband?" Lenora's expression grew distant. Charles was a good man, but our marriage was arranged by our families to benefit both railroad interests. We were cordial, considerate of each other's needs, but there was never any real passion or deep affection. I think we both understood that our relationship was essentially a business partnership. Like ours. Yes, I suppose very much like ours. Cole leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight. No wonder you approached this arrangement the way you did. It's the only kind of relationship you've ever known. And what about you, Mr. Maddox? You mentioned a wife once, but you've never spoken of her. Cole's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where he still carried the wooden replica of his father's brand. Sarah's memory was a wound that had never properly healed, made worse by the guilt he felt over their current arrangement. Sarah was everything good in this world, kind, patient, strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. She could make a house feel like home just by being in it. When she smiled, it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. You loved her very much, more than I knew it was possible to love another person. When she died, his voice broke, and he had to stop for a moment to regain control. When she died, giving birth to our son, who lived only 3 days, I thought my life was over. For 3 years, I've just been going through the motions of living. Lenora reached across the table and touched his hand, the first voluntary physical contact between them outside their contractual obligations. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for for putting you in a position that must feel like a betrayal of her memory. Cole looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how natural the contact felt. Maybe it started that way, but I don't think Sarah would want me to spend the rest of my life as a ghost. She was practical about survival, about doing what needed to be done. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, still touching, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Cole spoke again. She had a music box, one of the few pretty things we owned. It played some tune I never did learn the name of, but she'd wind it up in the evenings and listen while she did her mending. Where is it now? Packed away. In my gear. Haven't been able to bring myself to listen to it since she died. Perhaps, Lenora said quietly, it's time. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Cole Maddox opened the small wooden music box that had belonged to his wife. The delicate melody filled the ranch house kitchen, and as it played, he found himself telling Lenora about Sarah's laugh, about their plans for the future, about the dreams they had shared. Sarah's music box sat between them on the kitchen table, its gentle melody weaving through their conversation like a blessing from the past. For the first time since their arrangement began, both Cole and Lenora felt like they were connecting as human beings rather than parties to a contract. 6 months into their arrangement, Lenora Beck stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, studying a face that seemed to belong to a stranger. The pale, pampered complexion of her Boston days had given way to skin touched by sun and wind. Her hands, once soft beneath silk gloves, now bore the calluses of honest work. The transformation ran deeper than appearances. Something fundamental had shifted in the way she saw herself and the world around her. Her wedding ring caught the morning light, its gold band seeming to burn against her finger. She had worn it every day for 17 years, first as a symbol of duty, then as a widow's badge of respectability. Now it felt like a chain, binding her to a version of herself that no longer existed. The ring had belonged to Charles Beck's mother, passed down through generations of dutiful wives who had married for advantage rather than affection. Lenora had accepted it on her wedding day with the same resigned grace she had brought to every other aspect of their arrangement. It represented everything she was supposed to be: proper, conventional, safely contained within society's expectations. But the woman who stared back from the mirror bore little resemblance to the dutiful Mrs. Charles Beck, who had arrived in Red Bluff 6 months ago. Mrs. Beck! Cole's voice drifted through the house, carrying the easy familiarity that had developed between them over months of shared meals and evening conversations. Coffee's ready when you are. Coming, Mr. Maddox. She started to pull on her gloves, then stopped. The pristine white silk that had once been as essential as breathing now seemed absurd for a day of ranch work. Instead, she left them folded on the dresser and walked to the kitchen with her hands bare. Cole stood at the stove, his back turned as he tended to their breakfast. The months of good food and honest work had filled out his frame, erasing the hollow look that had marked him when they first met. His hair had grown longer, curling slightly at the collar, and she found herself noticing details that had nothing to do with their contractual arrangement. The way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the careful precision of his movements as he managed their morning routine. "You're up early again," she observed, accepting the coffee cup he offered. "Couldn't sleep. Been thinking about what Doc Harrison said yesterday." Harrison had visited the previous afternoon for their monthly consultation, bringing medical journals and the latest theories about fertility. His conclusions had been diplomatically phrased, but unmistakably discouraging. 6 months of regular attempts with no result suggested that conception might not occur at all. His assessment was rather pessimistic, Lenora agreed, sinking into her usual chair at the kitchen table. He said there might be other options. Adoption, maybe, or we could try different approaches. The suggestion hung between them, like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Adoption would mean acknowledging that their original arrangement had failed, that the clinical precision of their contract couldn't overcome the fundamental uncertainty of human biology. It would also mean making decisions about their future together that went beyond the terms they had originally agreed upon. "Mr. Maddox, I've been thinking about our situation. Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that this arrangement has run its course." Cole's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 6 months is long enough to determine whether our approach will succeed. If it hasn't worked by now, continuing to try may simply be prolonging an inevitable disappointment for both of us. You want to end our contract." The flatness in his voice made something clench painfully in Lenora's chest. "I want to be realistic about our prospects. You've fulfilled your part of our agreement in good faith. There's no reason for you to remain bound to an arrangement that isn't achieving its purpose." Cole set down his cup with deliberate care. "And what would you do? Go back to Boston?" "I suppose so. There's nothing keeping me here if our arrangement ends. Nothing keeping you here." He repeated her words as if testing their weight. 6 months of working together, talking together, building this place together, and you think there's nothing keeping you here? The edge in his voice surprised her. Their conversations had always been cordial, carefully controlled. This was the first time she had heard real emotion break through his usual reserve. "Mr. Maddox, our arrangement was always intended to be temporary. Stop calling it an arrangement." Cole stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Stop hiding behind contracts and clinical language. We've been living like husband and wife for 6 months, sharing meals and conversations, and a bed when your calculations say it's time. Don't pretend there's nothing personal in that." Lenora felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Our relationship has remained within the bounds we established." "Has it? Because the way you looked at me last week, when I was fixing the roof, or the way you've started leaving little things for me, cookies, a book you thought I'd like, your concern when I cut my hand on that barbed wire, none of that was in our contract." His words forced her to confront feelings she had been carefully avoiding. Somewhere in the routine of shared domesticity, their business arrangement had evolved into something more complex. She looked forward to their evening conversations, felt genuine concern for his well-being, and had begun to think of the ranch as home in a way her Boston mansion had never been. "What are you saying, Mr. Maddox?" "I'm saying maybe the reason our arrangement isn't working is because we're both pretending it's just business when it stopped being business months ago." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent so many years managing her emotions, controlling every aspect of her life through careful planning and rigid discipline, that she had failed to recognize when genuine feeling had crept into their careful arrangement. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been. You've already changed, Mrs. Beck. Look at yourself. Look at what you've built here. The woman who stepped off that stage 6 months ago wouldn't recognize the person sitting in this kitchen. Lenora glanced around their kitchen, because somewhere along the way she had begun thinking of it as theirs rather than hers. The room bore the marks of their shared occupancy. Cole's coffee cup in its familiar place, her medical journal sharing space with his whittling projects, Sarah's music box on the windowsill where the morning light could catch its silver inlay. With shaking fingers, she worked the wedding ring from her finger. The band came free with surprising ease, as if it too understood that its time had passed. She set it on the table between them, its gold surface reflecting the lamplight. 17 years, she whispered. I've worn this ring for 17 years. Cole stared at the abandoned ring, understanding its significance without explanation. What does this mean? I don't know. The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. I genuinely don't know what it means or what comes next, but I know I can't keep pretending that what's happened between us is just business. Cole reached across the table and covered her bare hand with his own. The contact sent warmth shooting through her system, different from their scheduled intimacies. This touch was freely given and freely received, unmarked by clinical necessity or contractual obligation. Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe we can just see what happens when we stop trying so hard to control every aspect of this. That terrifies me, Lenora admitted. Control is the only thing I've ever been good at. Then maybe it's time to learn something new. The wedding ring lay forgotten on the table between them as they sat holding hands in the morning. Light, two people who had stumbled into something neither had planned for or expected. The careful boundaries of their contract had dissolved, leaving them to navigate uncharted territory with nothing but growing trust and the fragile hope that what they were building together might prove stronger than the fears that had brought them together. The sound of careful woodworking drifted from the barn on a crisp November morning, accompanied by Cole's low humming. The first time Lenora had heard him make music since Sarah's music box had revealed its gentle melody weeks earlier. She approached the barn with a basket of sandwiches for their midday meal, curious about the project that had consumed his evenings for the past month. She found him bent over a workbench, surrounded by wood shavings and the tools he had crafted himself from. Salvaged metal. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and traced with old scars that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. But it was the object taking shape beneath his careful hands that made her breath catch in her throat. A cradle, hand-carved from seasoned oak, with flowing lines that suggested both strength and tenderness. The headboard bore the delicate outline of a rising sun, its rays spreading across the wood in graceful curves that could only have been shaped by someone who understood both carpentry and hope. Cole looked up as she entered, his hands stilling on the wood. Color rose in his cheeks as he realized what she had discovered. "Mrs. Beck, I didn't hear you coming." "Mr. Maddox." She set the basket aside and moved closer, drawn by the beauty of his workmanship. "This is extraordinary. It's probably foolish. We haven't had any success, and Doc Harrison says our chances get slimmer each month that passes." He ran his hand along the cradle's smooth edge. "But I kept thinking about it, about having something ready just in case." The vulnerability in his voice made something ache deep in Lenora's chest. This cradle represented more than woodworking. Skill, it embodied faith in their future, hope for the family they were trying to create. The fact that he had been working on it in secret, protecting this fragile optimism from her practical pessimism, revealed depths of feeling that their careful conversations had never touched. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Cole's eyes met hers, and for a moment the barn was charged with possibility. Then the sound of approaching horses shattered the intimate moment. Through the open door, they could see a fancy carriage making its way up the ranch road, pulled by a matched pair of bay geldings that cost more than most families saw in a year. "You expecting company?" Cole asked, already reaching for his work shirt. "No one knows where I am except—" Lenora's words died as recognition dawned. The carriage bore the distinctive brass fittings and emerald green lacquer that marked it, as belonging to the Whitmore family of Boston. "Oh no, that's Reginald Whitmore's carriage. Friend of yours?" "Hardly." Lenora's voice carried an edge of bitter amusement. "Reginald has been circling my fortune like a vulture since Charles died. He's proposed marriage 3 times, each proposal more elaborate and less appealing than the last." Cole's expression darkened. "What's he doing here?" "I can only imagine. Nothing good, certainly." They walked to the ranch house together, Cole's presence at her side, providing a comfort Lenora hadn't realized she needed. The carriage had pulled up in front of the porch, and its occupant was already stepping down with the careful precision of a man accustomed to making grand entrances. Reginald Whitmore was everything Charles Beck had been, only more so, older, wealthier, and possessed of the unshakable confidence that came from generations of inherited privilege. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his clothes cut from the finest cloth, and his smile held the calculated warmth of a practiced politician. He was exactly the sort of man Boston society would consider an ideal match for a wealthy widow. "Lenora, my dear," he swept off his hat with theatrical flourish. "You've led me quite a chase, but I've found you at last." "Reginald." Lenora's voice could have frozen summer rain. "What brings you to New Mexico territory?" "Concern for your well-being, naturally. When you disappeared from Boston without a word, your friends became quite worried. The stories we've heard about your circumstances out here are most disturbing." His gaze moved to Cole, taking in the work clothes, the calloused hands, the obvious intimacy between them. Disapproval radiated from every line of his perfectly postured frame. "I wasn't aware that my circumstances were anyone's concern but my own, my dear Lenora. A woman of your station wandering alone in the wilderness, associating with—" He gestured vaguely toward Cole. "Well, it simply isn't proper. You've clearly been taken advantage of by unscrupulous elements." Cole stepped forward, his full height making even Reginald's impressive stature seem diminished. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Reginald Whitmore of the Boston Whitmores, and you are—" "Cole Maddox. I work this ranch with Mrs. Beck." "Work this ranch." Reginald's laugh held no warmth. "How romantic. Lenora, surely you can see how inappropriate this situation has become. A woman of your breeding, living in primitive conditions with hired help." "Mr. Maddox is not hired help," Lenora said sharply. "He's my partner in this enterprise." "Partner?" Reginald's tone suggested the word left a bad taste in his mouth. "I see. Well, no matter. I've come to take you home where you belong." "I have. A proposal that will resolve all these unfortunate complications." "I'm not interested in your proposals, Reginald. I've made that clear on multiple occasions." But this proposal is different. I'm prepared to overlook your recent adventures and offer you the protection of marriage immediately. We can be wed within the month, and all this unfortunate business can be forgotten. The casual dismissal of her new life, the assumption that she needed his protection, the implication that her choices had been some kind of temporary madness, all of it combined to kindle a fury Lenora had never allowed herself to feel during her carefully controlled Boston years. "This unfortunate business, as you call it, happens to be my life, a life I chose freely and intend to continue living." "Don't be ridiculous, Lenora. You can't possibly mean to stay in this godforsaken place, living in squalor with—" He gestured, again toward Cole. "You have responsibilities to your family name, to proper society." "My responsibilities," Lenora said with deadly quiet, "are to myself and to the people I choose to share my life with. Neither includes you." Cole had remained silent during this exchange, but his stillness carried a quality of barely restrained violence that made even Reginald shift uncomfortably. The cradle hidden in the barn represented everything these two men represented to Lenora, one offering hope and partnership built through shared effort, the other demanding submission disguised as protection. You're making a grave mistake, Lenora. This infatuation with frontier life will pass, but the damage to your reputation may be irreversible. Then it's fortunate that I no longer care about my reputation. The words rang with conviction that surprised even Lenora. 6 months ago, reputation had been everything, the foundation upon which her entire identity rested. Now it seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. "I'll give you time to reconsider," Reginald said, his tone suggesting magnanimous patience. "I'm staying at the hotel in Red Bluff for the remainder of the week. When you come to your senses, you'll find me prepared to forgive this temporary lapse in judgment." "Don't hold your breath," Cole said quietly. Reginald's eyes snapped to him, registering the threat in those soft words. "I beg your pardon." The lady's made her position clear. "Might be time for you to accept it and move along. I hardly think a drifter's opinion carries weight in matters of civilized society." "Good thing we ain't in civilized society, then." The tension stretched between the two men, like a taut rope. Reginald was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice, while Cole radiated the controlled power of a man who had survived everything the frontier could throw at him. "Gentlemen," Lenora interrupted before the confrontation could escalate further. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you've had your answer. Mr. Maddox and I have work to do." Reginald climbed back into his carriage with wounded dignity, but his parting words carried the promise of future trouble. "This isn't over, Lenora. You'll realize your mistake soon enough." As the carriage disappeared down the ranch road, Cole and Lenora stood together on the porch, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. She had chosen him over wealth, comfort, and social acceptance. The choice had been public, witnessed, and irrevocable. "You didn't have to do that," Cole said quietly. "Yes, I did." Lenora turned to face him fully. 6 months ago I might have gone with him, but 6 months ago I was a different person. And now I know what I want, and it isn't a return to a life that never truly belonged to me. In the barn, the hand-carved cradle waited in its nest of wood shavings, a tangible symbol of the hope they were building together. Whether or not that cradle would ever hold a child remained uncertain, but the love that had inspired its creation was growing stronger with each choice they made to build a life together rather than simply fulfill a contract. Dr. Harrison arrived at the Morrison Ranch on a cold December morning, his medical bag clutched in hands that seemed older than his 57 years. The ride from town had given him ample time to rehearse the conversation ahead, but no amount of preparation could make his task easier. In his bag, alongside the usual collection of medical instruments and remedies, lay a letter that would destroy the foundation of everything Cole and Lenora had built together. He found them in the kitchen, sharing their usual breakfast routine. With the comfortable intimacy of a couple who had learned each other's habits over long months of shared domesticity, Lenora poured coffee without being asked, Cole passed the sugar without looking up from his plate, and both moved around each other in the small space with the unconscious choreography of genuine partnership. "Doc." Cole rose to shake his hand, noting the unusual gravity in the older man's expression. "Wasn't expecting you today." "Mr. Maddox, Mrs. Beck, I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share. Perhaps we could sit down." Lenora's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "What kind of news?" Harrison settled his considerable bulk into the chair they kept for visitors, his medical bag placed carefully on the floor beside him. "I've received some correspondence from a colleague in Boston, a Dr. Edmund Carlyle, who attended your late husband during his final illness." The color drained from Lenora's face. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with Mrs. Beck?" "Dr. Carlyle has made some revelations about your medical history that I believe you have a right to know. Information that your late husband apparently kept from you. Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Something in Harrison's tone warned him that whatever was coming would change everything, and he found himself wanting to stop the doctor from speaking to preserve the fragile happiness they had built in their ignorance. What information? Lenora's voice was barely above a whisper. Harrison reached into his bag and withdrew a sealed envelope, its expensive paper bearing the letterhead of a prominent Boston medical practice. Dr. Carlyle examined you extensively during the early years of your marriage at your husband's request. The examinations were quite thorough, involving several specialists. I remember some of those appointments. Charles said they were routine to ensure my general health. They were not routine, Mrs. Beck. They were specifically designed to assess your fertility. Harrison's hands shook slightly as he broke the seal on the envelope. The conclusion reached by Dr. Carlyle and his colleagues was definitive. Lenora's hand found Cole's across the table, her fingers gripping his with desperate strength. What conclusion? You have a congenital condition that makes pregnancy impossible. The medical term is Mayer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome, though at the time it was simply noted as congenital absence of reproductive structures. Your husband was informed of the diagnosis 17 years ago. The words fell into the kitchen like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward in ever-widening circles. Lenora stared at the doctor as if he were speaking a foreign language, her mind struggling to process information that rewrote the entire narrative of her adult life. That's impossible. I have monthly courses. The bleeding you experience is not menstruation, Mrs. Beck. It's the result of a different condition entirely, one that mimics the monthly cycle without indicating fertility. Your husband knew this, but chose never to inform you of the truth. Cole felt the strength drain from Lenora's fingers as the full implications hit her. 17 years of trying to conceive, 17 years of believing herself deficient, 17 years of hope and disappointment, all built on a lie. He knew. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Charles knew I could never have children, and he let me blame myself for 17 years. I'm afraid so. Dr. Carlyle says your husband felt it would be kinder to let you maintain hope rather than face the certainty of childlessness. Kinder, Lenora laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. He thought it was kinder to let me spend 17 years believing I was failing him, failing our families, failing as a woman. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's more, Mrs. Beck. Dr. Carlyle also reveals that your husband had a child with another woman, a mistress he maintained throughout your marriage. The child, a daughter, is now 16 years old. If the first revelation had been a stone dropped into still water, this was a boulder crashing through ice. Lenora's entire body went rigid, her face cycling through shock, understanding, and finally, a fury so pure it seemed to burn the air around her. A daughter. Dr. Carlyle included a photograph and details about the girl's circumstances. Apparently your husband provided for her financially, but never acknowledged her publicly. With his death, those arrangements have ended, and she is currently residing in a charitable institution. Cole watched helplessly as the woman he had come to love disintegrated before his eyes. Every foundation of her identity, her marriage, her sense of failure, her desperate journey west, all of it crumbling under the weight of truths that should have been shared decades ago. Mrs. Beck, Harrison continued gently, I want you to understand that this condition in no way reflects any failing on your part. It's a congenital condition, present from birth, and nothing you could have done differently would have changed the outcome. Get out. The words were spoken so quietly that Harrison almost missed them. I beg your pardon? Get out of my house. Take your letters and your belated truths and get out. Mrs. Beck, I understand you're upset, but perhaps we should discuss? There's nothing to discuss. Lenora's voice rose to a shout that made both men flinch. My entire adult life has been built on a lie, and you want to discuss it. Get out before I have Mr. Maddox throw you out." Harrison gathered his papers with shaking hands, clearly recognizing that his presence was not only unwanted, but potentially dangerous. "If you need to talk, if there's anything I can do, you've done enough." After the doctor's departure, silence settled over the kitchen like a shroud. Lenora sat motionless, staring at the wall as if she could see through it to some distant truth that had finally become visible. Cole remained beside her, afraid to speak, afraid to leave, afraid that any movement might shatter what little composure she had managed to maintain. "I can never have children." The words were spoken to the air, not to him, but Cole felt them, like a physical blow. Not because the information changed his feelings for her, those had evolved far beyond their original contractual arrangement, but because he could see how completely it destroyed her sense of purpose and identity. "Lenora, don't." She held up a hand to stop him. "Don't tell me it doesn't matter. Don't tell me we can find other ways. Don't tell me anything that sounds like comfort, because there is no comfort in this." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the land they had worked together for 8 months. "Everything I've done, every choice I've made since Charles died, has been based on a fundamental misconception about who I am and what I'm capable of. I came here to buy myself a child, and it turns out I was buying something that was never possible to achieve. Maybe the original reason doesn't matter anymore. Maybe we've built something that's worth more than what we started with." Lenora turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes was almost unbearable. "Have we, Cole? Have we really built something, or have we just been playing house while pursuing an impossible dream? You tell me. What do you think these past 8 months have been?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to break something inside her. "I thought I knew, but if the foundation was built on a lie, how can I trust anything that came after?" Cole stood and moved toward her, but she stepped back, maintaining the physical distance that suddenly felt like an emotional chasm. "I need a time to think. I need to understand what this means for everything. And us? What does this mean for us?" Lenora's silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer. Cole felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same hollow certainty that had filled him when Sarah died, the knowledge that happiness was always temporary, always built on foundations too fragile to support the weight of real life. The doctor's letter lay forgotten on the kitchen table, its revelations having accomplished in minutes what 8 months of careful relationship building had failed to achieve. It had destroyed the illusion that brought them together and left them both wondering whether what remained was strong enough to survive the truth. 3 days passed in silence, heavier than the December snow that had begun to fall across the New Mexico territory. Lenora moved through the ranch house like a ghost, haunting familiar rooms, performing the mechanical tasks of daily survival, while her mind wrestled with truths that had rewritten the entire story of her life. Cole gave her the space she seemed to need, but the careful distance between them felt like a physical wound that deepened with each passing hour. On the 4th morning, Lenora sat at the kitchen table with her packed trunk beside her and a stagecoach ticket in her hands. The ticket bore yesterday's date from Red Bluff, a one-way passage back to Boston, back to the life she had tried so desperately to escape. She had purchased it during a solitary ride to town, driven by the same desperate need for control that had brought her west 8 months earlier. Cole found her there when he returned from his morning chores, his boots crunching on the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The sight of her trunk, the formal way she held herself, the careful distance she had maintained for days, all of it told him what her words had not yet confirmed. "You're leaving. I think it's best." Her voice carried the same controlled politeness she had used during their first meeting, as if 8 months of intimacy and growing love could be erased by a return to formal courtesy. "Our arrangement has reached its conclusion. Our arrangement." Cole's repetition of her words carried a weight of disappointment that made her flinch. "Is that what you're calling it now? What else would you call it? We entered into a business agreement that has proven impossible to fulfill. The logical next step is to dissolve our association and return to our separate lives. Cole sank into the chair across from her, studying her face for any trace of the woman who had removed her wedding ring in this same kitchen, who had chosen him over Reginald Whitmore's wealth and respectability, who had learned to find joy in the simple rhythms of ranch life. What about everything else? What about the past 8 months? The past 8 months were built on false premises. I came here seeking something that was never possible to achieve. Everything that followed was just an elaborate form of self-deception. Was it? Or did we find something neither of us expected? Lenora's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain she had been working so hard to contain. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Cole. We both know that without the original purpose, there's no reason for this arrangement to continue. No reason. Cole's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 8 months of building a life. Together, learning to care about each other, finding something that felt like home. And you think there's no reason to continue? What we found was an illusion, based on a shared delusion. Remove the delusion and the illusion crumbles. Cole stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Maybe for you, it was an illusion. For me, it was the first time in 3 years that I felt alive again. The words hung between them like an accusation. Lenora closed her eyes, fighting against the tears that threatened to break through her carefully maintained control. The stage leaves at noon, she said finally. I'll be gone within the hour. And then what? You go back to Boston and pretend none of this happened. I go back to Boston and try to rebuild a life based on reality instead of impossible dreams. Cole moved to the window, staring out at the land they had worked together. The improvements they had made, the future they had begun to envision. And what about the ranch? It's yours if you want it. The deed is in your name along with mine. I had the papers drawn up last month. Consider it payment for services rendered. The casual dismissal of their partnership as services rendered hit Cole like a physical blow. He turned from the window, his face reflecting a pain that matched her own. Services rendered. Is that what you think this has been? I don't know what else to call it. How about love? How about 2 broken people who found something worth fixing in each other? The word love hung in the air between them. The first time either had spoken it aloud, despite the growing evidence of its presence in their daily lives. Lenora's breath caught, and for a moment, her careful composure wavered. Love built on a lie isn't really love at all. The lie wasn't ours, Lenora. The lie belonged to your husband, to a past that has nothing to do with what we've built here. Doesn't it? Everything I am, everything I thought I knew about myself, was shaped by that lie. How can I trust my feelings when I don't even know who I really am? Cole crossed the room in 3 quick strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. I know who you are. You're the woman who was brave enough to travel 1,500 miles to chase an impossible dream. You're the woman who learned to work with her hands, who found joy in simple things, who chose to build something real instead of hiding behind social conventions. Those things were motivated by false premises. No, his voice was firm, cutting through her objections. Those things came from who you really are, underneath all the lies and expectations. The woman I've come to love doesn't exist because of what your husband told you or didn't tell you. She exists because you chose to become her. Lenora felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the intensity of his words. Cole, please, don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not trying to make it harder. I'm trying to make it possible for you to stay. Why? Why would you want me to stay when our entire relationship was built on deception? Because somewhere, in the middle of all that deception, we found something real, something worth fighting for. A knock at the front door interrupted their confrontation, followed by the sound of multiple voices calling Lenora's name. Through the window, they could see a small group approaching the house. Dr. Harrison, Bill Jameson, and several other. Men from town, their faces grave with some urgent purpose. Cole opened the door to find Harrison holding an official-looking document, his expression carrying the weight of difficult news. "Mrs. Beck, Mr. Maddox, I'm afraid there's been a development regarding the information I shared the other day." "What kind of development?" Lenora asked, her voice steady despite the emotional storm of the past few minutes. "I've received additional correspondence from Boston, along with some legal documents. It seems there's a young girl, your late husband's daughter, who is in desperate need of assistance." Harrison unfolded the document, revealing an adoption petition and a photograph of a 16-year-old girl with dark hair and intelligent eyes that bore a striking resemblance to the man who had never acknowledged her existence. "Her name is Maria Sandoval. Her mother was Mexican, worked in your husband's household until her death 5 years ago. The girl has been surviving on the streets of Boston since your husband's death ended his financial support. She's currently being held at a charitable institution, but her circumstances are dire." Lenora stared at the photograph, seeing in the girl's face an echo of the husband who had deceived her for 17 years. But she also saw something else: intelligence, determination, and a strength that reminded her of someone else entirely. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because, Mrs. Beck, you're the only family she has left. And because the institution is preparing to send her to one of the industrial schools that don't have the best reputation for caring for girls of mixed heritage." Bill Jameson stepped forward, hat in hand. "Ma'am, we took the liberty of making some inquiries. That girl could be here within the month if someone was willing to take responsibility for her care." Cole studied the photograph over Lenora's shoulder, noting the girl's direct gaze and the way she held herself despite what were obviously difficult circumstances. She looked strong. According to the reports, she's remarkably resilient. Educated herself by reading discarded newspapers, learned English and Spanish with equal fluency, and has been caring for younger children at the institution despite her own difficult situation. Lenora felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with blood relation and everything to do with seeing herself reflected in another person's struggle for survival and dignity. "Adoption," she said quietly. "You're suggesting adoption?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes family is something we choose rather than something we inherit through biology," Harrison said carefully. "And that sometimes the most important legacy we can leave isn't the one we create, but the one we rescue." The adoption papers lay spread across the kitchen table beside Lenora's packed trunk and unused stage ticket. 3 paths stretched before her: return to Boston and the hollow respectability of her former life, stay at the ranch and try to rebuild what had been damaged by truth, or take a third option that none of them had considered until this moment. "She would be my daughter," Lenora said, testing the words. "Not by blood, but by choice." "By choice," Cole agreed. "The way all the best families are made." For the first time in 4 days, Lenora looked directly at him, really seeing him instead of looking through him toward some distant escape. "And what would you think of that? Of taking responsibility for someone else's child?" "I'd think it was the most natural thing in the world for the woman I love to open her heart to a child who needs one." The word love settled between them again, but this time it carried the weight of possibility rather than accusation. Lenora looked down at the adoption papers, at the photograph of a girl whose eyes held the same determination that had carried her west in search of an impossible dream. "I don't know if I know how to be a mother. I don't know if I know how to be a father again, but maybe we could learn together." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that suggested new beginnings were always possible for those brave enough to reach for them. The ornate carriage bearing Reginald Whitmore's family crest arrived at the Morrison Ranch with theatrical precision, its brass fittings gleaming despite the December snow. Behind it followed a second, more modest vehicle, carrying 2 men in expensive suits, and a woman whose bearing suggested the authority of legal or social position. Lenora watched their approach from the kitchen window. The adoption papers for Maria Sandoval still spread across the table where they had been discussing the possibility of becoming a family through choice rather than biology. "He's brought reinforcements," Cole observed, moving to stand beside her at the window. "So it would seem." Lenora's voice carried the calm that had settled over her since their conversation about Maria. The desperate uncertainty of the past 4 days had crystallized into something approaching peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of finally understanding what she truly wanted. Reginald emerged from the lead carriage with his usual theatrical flourish, but his companions were clearly the real power in this delegation. The woman carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, while the 2 men bore the unmistakable stamp of legal professionals prepared for battle. "Mrs. Beck," Reginald called as they approached the house, "I've brought some friends who are most concerned about your welfare." Lenora opened the door before they could knock, meeting their delegation on the porch with Cole's solid presence at her side. "Mr. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting additional visitors." "Lenora, my dear, allow me to present Mrs. Abigail Thornton, Director of the Ladies' Protective Society of Boston, and attorneys Messrs. Blackwood and Morrison, representing your late husband's estate." Mrs. Thornton stepped forward with the confident bearing of a woman who had made a career of managing other people's affairs. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark clothing suggested both respectability and authority. "Mrs. Beck, your friends in Boston are deeply concerned about reports of your conduct since leaving civilization. We've come to discuss your return to proper society and the restoration of your good name." "I wasn't aware my good name needed restoration." Attorney Blackwood cleared his throat and withdrew a leather portfolio from his coat. "Mrs. Beck, I'm afraid there are legal complications regarding your husband's estate that require immediate attention. Complications that have arisen due to your unconventional living arrangements." "What kind of complications?" "Your inheritance was left in trust, with certain conditions regarding your conduct and moral character. The trustees have received reports about your cohabitation with—" he gestured dismissively toward Cole, "with this individual, and they are prepared to revoke your access to the estate unless you return immediately to Boston and enter into an appropriate marriage." The threat was delivered with the calm precision of a man accustomed to using financial leverage to control behavior. Lenora felt Cole's tension beside her, but her own response surprised her with its clarity. "And if I refuse, then you forfeit. Everything, the house on Beacon Hill, the railroad investments, the entire Beck fortune. You would be left with nothing but whatever arrangements you've made here in the wilderness." Mrs. Thornton added her voice to the ultimatum. "Lenora, surely you can see that this infatuation with frontier life is merely a temporary aberration, brought on by grief. No woman of proper breeding could seriously consider abandoning civilization for this primitive existence." Cole stepped forward slightly, his presence a subtle reminder that she was not facing this alone. "Ma'am, seems to me that's Mrs. Beck's decision to make." "The decision," Attorney Morrison interjected, "must be made immediately. We have a train departing Red Bluff tomorrow morning, and passage reserved for Mrs. Beck's return to Boston. The trustees will not extend their patience beyond that deadline." Lenora looked at the papers they were extending toward her, legal documents that would restore her access to millions of dollars in exchange for abandoning everything she had built in New Mexico. The choice was stark: wealth and respectability, or love and the uncertain future of a chosen family. "I need a moment to consider." "Of course," Reginald said smoothly, "but do remember, my dear, that some opportunities don't come twice. I'm prepared to marry you immediately upon our return to Boston, which would satisfy the trustees' requirements and restore your position in society." Lenora walked to the kitchen table, where the adoption papers lay beside her abandoned stage. ticket. The photograph of Maria Sandoval stared up at her, a 16-year-old girl whose mixed heritage had made her unwelcome in the same Boston society that was now demanding Lenora's return. She picked up her inheritance documents, feeling their weight both literally and symbolically. Generations of Beck family wealth, accumulated through railroad investments and careful marriages, reduced to a few pages of legal text. Then she moved to the fireplace, where the morning's fire still burned low but steady. "Lenora," Reginald called sharply as he realized her intention, "don't be foolish. That represents security for the rest of your life." "No," she said quietly, holding the documents above the flames. "This represents everything that kept me from having a life at all." The papers caught fire with surprising eagerness, curling and blackening as years of financial security transformed into ash and smoke. The delegation from Boston watched in horrified silence as Lenora Beck deliberately destroyed her claim to one of New England's great fortunes. "There," she said, turning back to face them with calm satisfaction. "The trustees no longer need to concern themselves with my moral character. I am no longer their responsibility." Mrs. Thornton found her voice first. "You've lost your senses." "Completely. No rational woman would. I am no longer interested in being rational according to Boston's definition. I'm interested in being happy according to my own." The adoption papers lay waiting on the table, an invitation to create family through love rather than inherit it through obligation. Lenora signed her name with steady hands while the shocked delegation watched their carefully planned intervention crumble into irrelevance. The little church in Red Bluff had never hosted a wedding quite like the one that took place on a snowy January morning, 3 weeks after Lenora Beck burned her inheritance documents. Word had spread through the territory about the Eastern widow, who had chosen love over millions, and the tiny building was packed with ranchers, cowboys, shopkeepers, and their families, all eager to witness what local legend was already calling the most romantic story in New Mexico Territory history. Maria Sandoval sat in the front pew, her dark hair braided with wildflowers that Lenora had picked that morning despite the snow. The 16-year-old had arrived from Boston 2 days earlier, stepping off the stage with nothing but a battered suitcase and the same determined intelligence that had shone from her photograph. Her first words to Lenora had been spoken in careful English. "Are you certain you want me? I'm not easy to love." Lenora's response, "Neither am I, but I'm hoping we can learn together," had broken through the girl's carefully maintained reserve. Now Maria clutched a small bouquet of winter roses, her role as unofficial flower girl marking her acceptance into a family that was being forged through choice rather than blood. She watched with bright eyes as the woman who had chosen to be her mother walked down the aisle toward the man who had agreed to be her father. Lenora wore a simple blue dress made by the seamstress in Red Bluff, its modest cut and practical fabric, marking her complete transformation from Boston society matron to frontier wife. Her hair was arranged simply, held back with combs that Cole had carved from pieces of the same oak used for the cradle that waited in their barn. She carried no elaborate bouquet, no family jewelry, no symbols of inherited wealth, only the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally learned the difference between what she thought she wanted and what she actually needed. Cole waited at the altar wearing his best shirt and the suit coat that Bill Jameson had loaned him for the occasion. His hands held a pair of simple silver rings, crafted by the local blacksmith, circles of metal that had cost less than one of Lenora's former gloves, but carried more meaning than all the elaborate jewelry she had abandoned in Boston. Pastor Williams, a circuit preacher who visited Red Bluff once a month, had initially been skeptical about performing the ceremony. The unusual circumstances of their courtship, combined with the scandalous stories about their arrangement, had tested his moral flexibility. But one conversation with the couple had convinced him that whatever had brought them together, what they had found deserved the blessing of both God and community. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, We are gathered here today to witness the union of Cole Maddox and Lenora Beck in holy matrimony, a union that reminds us all that the Lord works in mysterious ways and that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil. The vows they exchanged were simple, personal, and honest, in a way that Lenora's first wedding had never been. When Cole promised to honor both her strength and her vulnerability, to support her dreams even when he couldn't fully understand them, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay. When Lenora vowed to build a life with him based on truth rather than convenience, on partnership rather than obligation, her voice rang with the conviction of someone who had finally learned the difference between a marriage and a merger. "The rings," Pastor Williams prompted. Cole took Lenora's left hand, noting the faint mark where her wedding band had left its impression after 17 years. The simple silver ring slid onto her finger with no resistance, fitting as if it had been made specifically for her, which, in a way, it had. The blacksmith had crafted it to Cole's specifications, creating something beautiful from raw materials, and through honest labor. "With this ring," Cole said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "I promise to love you not for who you were or who you might become, but for who you are in this moment and every moment we're given together." Lenora's hands shook slightly as she placed the matching ring on Cole's finger, but her voice was clear and strong. "With this ring, I promise to choose you every day. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and Almighty God," Pastor Williams declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cole, you may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was gentle, reverent, and witnessed by a church, full of people who understood that they were seeing something rare. Two people who had found each other not through social arrangement or family connection, but through the mysterious alchemy of genuine compatibility and hard-won trust. As they turned to face their community as husband and wife, Maria jumped up from the front pew and threw her wildflower bouquet with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been part of a celebration in her honor. The flowers scattered over the congregation like a blessing, and the church erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard 3 blocks away. Outside, the January snow continued to fall, blanketing Red Bluff in pristine white that seemed to promise fresh starts for everyone brave enough to reach for them. The newly married couple walked through the church doors hand in hand, with their chosen daughter between them, ready to build something entirely their own, from the raw materials of love, trust, and unwavering commitment to choosing each other. Every single day, the simple silver rings caught the winter light, reflecting back the promise of a love that had been tested by truth and found strong enough to last. 1 year later, the Morrison Ranch bore little resemblance to the abandoned property Lenora had purchased 18 months earlier. The house gleamed with fresh paint and careful maintenance. The barn stood solid against the New Mexico winds, and the corrals held a small but thriving herd of cattle. More importantly, the property had gained something that no amount of money could purchase: the settled contentment of a place where people belonged. Lenora stood on the front porch in the early morning light, watching Cole work with a young colt in the breaking pen. Her calloused hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her simple cotton dress bore the practical stains of a woman who spent her days cooking, gardening, and managing the countless tasks that kept a working ranch operational. The transformation from Boston society matron to frontier wife was complete, written in every line of her sun-weathered face and every confident movement of her work-hardened body. Inside the house, Maria was preparing for her first day at the newly established Red Bluff School, her dark hair braided neatly and her second-hand dress mended with careful stitches. The 16-year-old had adapted to ranch life with the resilience of someone who had learned early that survival depended on flexibility rather than rigid expectations. Her English had improved dramatically over the past year. though she still lapsed into Spanish when excited or frustrated, much to the delight of her adopted parents who were slowly learning the language themselves. "Mama Lenora," Maria called. From the kitchen, using the name that had evolved naturally from their first awkward attempts at defining their relationship. "The teacher said I should bring something to share about my family. What should I tell them?" Lenora smiled at the question that would have seemed impossible to answer a year ago. "Tell them the truth, that families are made in many different ways, and the best ones are built on choice rather than chance." Maria appeared in the doorway, her intelligent eyes bright with curiosity. "And what should I say about Papa Cole's cradle? The other children will want to know if there's a baby coming." The cradle still sat in the corner of Maria's bedroom, its hand-carved surfaces polished to a warm glow by months of careful tending. It had never held the infant for which it was originally intended, but it had become something more precious, symbol of hope that had evolved beyond its original purpose. Maria used it to hold her collection of books, her sewing projects, and the small treasures she had accumulated during her transformation from street orphan to beloved daughter. "Tell them," Lenora said carefully, "that the cradle is holding something very precious, our family's dreams for the future." Cole approached the house, his morning chores completed, and found his wife and daughter sharing one of the quiet conversations that had become the foundation of their daily routine. The sight of them together, heads bent close, voices low with the intimacy of shared secrets, still filled him with wonder at the unlikely path that had brought them all together. "Morning, ladies." He kissed Lenora's cheek, then ruffled Maria's carefully arranged hair in the way that had become his paternal privilege. "Ready for your first day of proper schooling, young lady?" "Ready as I'll ever be." Maria's English carried only the slightest trace of accent now, though her Spanish remained fluent and beautiful. "Though I still think I've learned more from you and Mama Lenora than any school can teach me." "Different kinds of learning," Cole said wisely. "School learning and life learning both have their place." After Maria left for town in the wagon they had purchased for such occasions, Cole and Lenora settled into the comfortable routine that had evolved over months of shared domesticity. They worked together to tend their small herd, repair fences damaged by winter storms, and plan improvements for the coming growing season. The easy partnership they had developed bore no resemblance to the awkward business arrangement that had originally brought them together. "Sometimes I wonder," Lenora mused as they took a break from mending tack, "what would have happened if Dr. Harrison had never received that letter from Boston, if we had never learned the truth about my condition? Would it have mattered?" Cole asked, settling beside her on the porch steps. "By the time that letter came, we had already stopped being about the original arrangement." "Had we? I sometimes think I was still clinging to the idea that our purpose was to create a child together." "Maybe that was our purpose," Cole said thoughtfully, "just not in the way we expected." They both looked toward the road where Maria would return. That evening, full of stories about her day and questions about everything she had encountered. The child they had gained bore no biological relationship to either of them, but she had fulfilled the deepest longing of their hearts in ways that bloodline never could have achieved. "She drew us a picture last week," Lenora said, reaching into her apron pocket to withdraw a folded piece of paper. "A picture of our family." The drawing was done in the careful hand of someone who had learned art from observation rather than formal training. It showed the three of them standing in front of their ranch house, with Maria in the center holding both their hands. Above them, a sun with a smiling face beamed down on their simple happiness. At the bottom, in carefully printed letters, Maria had written, "My family, made by love." Cole studied the drawing, noting the way Maria had captured not just their physical appearances but something essential about their relationship. In the child's eyes, they were not a widow, a grieving cowboy, and an abandoned girl who had found each other through desperate circumstances. They were simply a family who belonged together. "She sees us more clearly than we see ourselves sometimes," he observed. Children often do. Lenora folded the drawing carefully and returned it to her pocket. They understand that love is what makes a family, not blood or law or social convention. As the sun climbed higher over the New Mexico landscape, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red, the Morrison Ranch settled into another day of the ordinary miracles that had become their life. There would be cattle to tend, meals to prepare, lessons to teach and learn, and the 1,000 small acts of consideration that bound them together as surely as any legal document or biological connection. The hand-carved cradle sat in Maria's room, holding books instead of a baby, dreams instead of diapers. It had never served its original purpose, but it had become something more valuable, a symbol of hope that had transformed into reality, proof that the most important things in life are often found in the most unexpected places. Outside, the New Mexico wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across land that had become home to 3 people who had discovered that the best families are not inherited, but chosen, not planned, but discovered, not bought, but built through the daily choice to love each other exactly as they are.